Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 10 today and complete the chapter with this battle between David, served by Joab this time, as well as Abishai, as we'll see, against the Ammonites and the mercenary band of Arameans and others that the Ammonites have gathered with them against David and Joab. And as we do, I assume that for you and for me, who cares about the details of this ancient battle for its own sake? I don't even think the authors care. I think what we're seeing is a stylized formation that, as we'll see, is parallel to what we saw in chapter 8, but is also not only anticipating the downfall of David that begins in the next chapter, and as we've been looking at in the shape of the story, the Ammonite part at least will continue after the Bathsheba-Uriah situation here. So after our scene here, it'll continue there, although it's only Ammonites in that part and not Arameans there. And it'll also come up again in the battle against Absalom's rebellion, starting in chapter 16 and 17. We'll see a number of links between our immediate scene there and our scene there. So what I'd like to suggest that's going on here is this story is part of what I've been looking at in the structure of this unit that highlights that the entire monarchical project, and David's reign in particular, are doomed to have tragic outcomes. And as we've been looking at throughout, this is not a matter of sources, as some scholars would say, that there's a pro-David source and an anti-David source that are at odds with each other, but of a multi-voice narrative that right within the time it's praising David is also criticizing him, highlighting for alert readers that although David's at the peak of his military success right here, the seeds for his destruction and the destruction of the monarchy itself are already being laid, because the entire project is a betrayal of loyalty to Yahweh as the only true king over the people. So we're going to pay attention to some of the subtext here more than the surface, although of course we'll look at the surface as well. In the keywords, I'd like to look at two elements here, and as we've been looking at, as I showed last time, too, each of our three chapters has its own kind of keywords. In this section today, and what we're looking at beginning here, we looked at this part ahead, and I noted last time that sent was such a common key word here, as well as all the indirect speech of David was told, the Ammonites were told, etc. But in our unit now, starting here, we see a curious array of words that are gathered in little clusters. So the Hebrew for arrayed is 3 times here and 1 time down here. Similarly, the word for fled is 3 times together here and 1 time down here. And the word for strong is 4 times in 2 verses, but not elsewhere. And a number of those words are not only not elsewhere in this chapter, but are not elsewhere anywhere in the region of 2 Samuel. So we're clearly seeing this linked into little units here around those key words. But another way to look at this, and that's what I wanted to do to highlight the connection with the shape here, the connection between 8 and 14, is to focus just on the Aramean aspect of this. So we saw the Arameans here came to help King Hadadezer of Zobah, and we saw that incident and how Hadadezer was highlighted there. Now the Arameans are hired by the Ammonites, and then we see how much the Arameans are mentioned. The Ammonites are the main people being attacked here, and the Arameans are simply their mercenaries, but we see how many times the Arameans are mentioned here. And so the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. And we won't see the Arameans mentioned anymore in the rest of 2 Samuel, but there's an interesting footnote, as we'll see in 2 Kings, that we'll look at in a little bit. So that's just something of the shape of our story, and I'll just leave this up here as we begin to jump through it. Again, not focusing on all the details of the battle, but on the stylized aspect that the writers are trying to draw our attention to. So this is after, of course, if you haven't paid attention to it last time, when the Ammonite Sarai, which would say their princes or their leaders, convinced their king Hanun that David wasn't trustworthy because he sent messengers for consolation, and in response Hanun cut off half the beards and half the clothing of David's warriors and sent them back, plainly provoking war. So that's where we are. So the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array. And again, this is a particular word here. You can't pronounce it without the vowel there. But you see 3 times in this section, only 1 other time in 2 Samuel. So we see the Ammonites there at the entrance of the gate, and although the city, Rabbah, hasn't been named yet, that's plainly the city is at issue. That's where the continuation is in chapter 12. But the Arameans of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Toba and Makkah were out there in the open country, more literally in the field, Bahasadeh, in the field connecting with David's taking control of Saul's land from Mephibosheth we saw last time. when Joab saw the battle was set, so we'd already heard that David called in Joab, but this is the first time that David is being shown in this entire unit of chapters 8 to 10 as acting not unilaterally. Why bring Joab here? I'd like to suggest Joab is going to be central to the next scene with Uriah and Bathsheba. It'll be it'll be Joab who gets the message that David sends with Uriah to put Uriah in the front and let him get killed and not worry about it. So we're setting up here the closeness of David and Joab, as well as we'll see that it'll be Joab who helps David recover from his grief after Absalom is killed. At his command, of course, Absalom was both his son and his enemy, and so when he's crying in mourning, it's Joab who says, "Watch your soldiers, they're going to think they risk their lives for nothing." So Joab, up till now, has not been seen as a partner so much with David as one of the three sons of Zeruiah, along with his dead brother and his living brother, we'll see here, but now we're seeing him tightly connected with David. So that's the main point here. So when Joab saw the battle was set against him, both in front and rear, he chose some of the picked men, or literally he chose some of the chosen men. You see the word bakar twice there. I didn't highlight it because it's twice, not three times, but you can see the pattern here. So he chose some of the chosen men. We'd already seen that the Gibborim were there, which you'd think would be the crack troops. So this is some other category that we don't know what they're about. And so he arrays them against the Arameans. And the rest of his men, Yether here, and it's again only a couple times in connecting with the return of the battle here in 1228, so making that connection. He put in charge of his brother Abishai. First time we've seen him since 330, where Joab and Abishai were involved in the murder of Abner. And we had not even known that he went into battle with Joab. And his next scene will be, yes, as you can expect, in the midst of the Absalom rebellion, one of those many connections. So Joab and Abishai here, the two remaining sons of Zeruiah, and he said, if the Arameans are too strong, or literally, this is literally too strong, and we see that twice, then you shall help me. This is the one I want to highlight. Literally, you shall give me salvation, or you shall save me. It echoes Yahweh, described in chapter 6 as give victory, but really it was salvation there. I didn't translate it literally there, as I am here. And again in 10:19. So twice about Yahweh in chapter 8, and twice here about David and Joab, but highlighting the point that it's Yahweh who saves, not David and Joab who save. And notice they're not calling upon Yahweh. There's no prayer here. It wasn't like we saw David asking earlier, should I go up against the Philistines or not? And he gets positive responses, unlike Saul who didn't. There's no consulting Yahweh at all. There's simply this passing comment, may Yahweh do what seems good to him, or literally what's good in his eyes. But there's no sense here that David and Joab are in close relationship with Yahweh, or that Yahweh is the one who's actually doing the battle. This is really just about two human beings fighting for their glory and for their nation. So let us be courageous here, which is not in the Masoretic text. This is following the Septuagint here. And androzomi, literally be manly. You can see andri here as an andros, or androcentric for male-centric. So literally be a man or be manly, appealing to that sort of valiant, violent sense of masculinity, common then and now, as we know. So be manly here for the sake of our people. And notice that Joab isn't concerned with David's name, but for the protection of the people here. And for the cities of our God, which is a very unusual thing, because we certainly know Jerusalem is the city of David, but what other cities are being named here? David ruled over Hebron, and maybe that's one. Notice this is Elohim, and this is Yahweh here. So for the cities of our God as Elohim is doubly unusual to highlight the cities. And may Yahweh do, as I noted, what looks good in his eyes. And again, that's a Deuteronomistic phrase, contrasting it at the end of Judges. Every person did what was good in their own eyes, and that's what leads to having a king. Instead of paying attention to Yahweh and letting Yahweh do what's good in Yahweh's eyes. So many, many clues along the way that this victory and success of David is not in harmony with Yahweh, but is over against Yahweh, even though we're told that Yahweh loves David. So continuing on here. So Joab and the people who were with him moved forward in a battle against the Arameans, and all of a sudden they fled. All those Arameans counted as thousands, they fled, and we see the fleeing 3 times in these couple of verses. So the Arameans fled, the Ammonites saw the Arameans fled, they likewise fled, with no apparent battle. After all this be strong and all this question of if they're all divided, they just seem to show up and they just melt, like frost in the morning. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. Why? Did Abishai go with him? We don't know, but that's going to leave David apparently alone on his own again. So with Joab back in Jerusalem, the battle continues here. And notice, as I was highlighting last time here, the constant element of indirect understanding. When the Arameans saw they had been not defeated by Israel, but smitten, from the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon here. Again, just like we saw in chapter 8, where it often says defeated or killed, but it's not that bad. This is just they've been hit, not that they've been defeated. There's no sense of defeat here. They gathered themselves together, and using two interesting words, yahad, which is a word for unitedness. So they gathered into a unity here. It's a parallel with verse 17 when David gathers them, but he doesn't say he gathered them into unity. It uses the gathering word here, esaf, but not yahad. So it's an interesting contrast there with these people gathered into a unity, but David's people are not said to be divided that way. And we recall last video where Alter noted that this entire chapter involves cutting things in half, beards and clothes, and the troops separated between Joab and David. And so the gathering here is in contrast with all the dividing we'd otherwise seen. So meanwhile, Hadadezer again, as if we already expected him to be here, and as my chart here shows, you can see he's first mentioned down here, but he'd been clearly part of that up there. So he sent and brought the Arameans who were from beyond the Euphrates. And we look at the map, the Euphrates isn't even on this map. That's way off over this way. And we see how widespread this entire battle is. That David is just a king over this area really down here. And yet all this battle is people up from this whole range here of Tob and Ammon and Aram and Zobah all up there. And they came to Helam, although Helam is on the map. Archaeologically, we really don't know where it is. With another new person here, Shobak, only mentioned here, and we don't know why, because we don't know anything else about him other than his name here. The commander of the army of Hadadezer at their head. So he's parallel to Joab here. And so, again, indirect communication. And as far as we know, David is still out there. Joab, we're told, came to Jerusalem, but as far as we can tell, David has not returned. Otherwise, why would it specify that Joab returned and not say they all returned or Joab and David returned? So we have to assume that David's out there somewhere, but he's getting this message of these troops coming from this huge distance away. And so he gathers all Israel together. Notice it's not specifying the specific troops. It doesn't use a military word like we just saw for the chosen. He chose the chosen, or the Gibborim as we saw in the last scene, or anything about soldiers. It's suggesting he's gathered the entire nation together and crossed the Jordan. And how symbolic is that of Moses' role? Of course, Moses doesn't cross the Jordan. He gives it to Joshua to cross the Jordan. And the phrase cross the Jordan here, Vayaver at Hayarden, is only in Deuteronomy, Moses talking about it happening there, in the beginning of Joshua, a couple times in Judges, and here, and not elsewhere. So it really jumps out of the text as a symbol of the entering into the land. The Jordan as a river is only once in 2 Samuel earlier in 2:29, and next, guess when? In the Absalom rebellion, one of many links there, and then 10 times in chapter 19 with David crossing the Jordan. It's symbolically to regain his reign there as well as Absalom. So certainly this is one of those hints, not only back to the beginning that they weren't supposed to have a king in the first place, but also to the sense of in the land and the future of David, who's going to be subject to crossing the wrong way in the face of Absalom. So this is crossing over into being in the battle over here. So crossing the Jordan the wrong way, if you'll so to speak, from Jerusalem up over to here. So the Arameans arrayed themselves against David and fought with him like it's just him alone. Again, Joab and Abishai and the army don't even seem to be present. And again, they flee. So the Arameans flee, interestingly, not before David, but before Israel. So giving the credit here to a sense of Israel here, and David not killed, but struck again 700 chariot teams and 40,000 horsemen. The sense of this relatively small group taking on all these people and having them all flee, as if just the sight of David and Joab and Abishai is just terrifying, is certainly exaggeration, but certainly works to the glory of David, despite the fact that we're seeing all these hints that it's all going to come down. And he wounded Shobak the commander, and so he died there, and that's the end of Shobak. And so one more verse to finish our passage here. When all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer, and who are they? Who are the kings who are servants of Hadadezer? We don't know anything about him as a king here having control over any of these other people. So that's a strange thing, and it's just left there, so we don't know much about them. Again, not defeated, had been struck. They made peace with Israel, and yet we don't see anything about that. Did they make peace with David? Notice how it's shifted from David to now it's Israel. It's about the nation Israel, and became subject to them, to the Israelites, not specifically to King David. So at the very end of our unit here, it shifts to being about the nation. And I think that's a subtle hint too, that this whole section, is it really about raising up David? Is the point of having a king so we can go, hey, we had this great King David? Or is the point of having a king to protect you from your enemies so the nation can be at peace? Well, the nation's at peace now, but the war continues. And we'll see what David's doing when the war continues next time. See you for that. Bye-bye.